very engaging time prior to this meeting. We got some important information to cover here. Let's do a couple of things here. Do we have a quorum? I think we do, Madam Attorney. We do. We do have a quorum. It's my responsibility as chairman to make sure that if there is any conflicts of interest, that we have an opportunity to address those. And in doing so, I'll read what's in our report here. General Statute 138A15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether there any member knows or any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to the matter before the Environmental Management Commission, Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflicts, please state so at this time. Is there anyone here that would need to resolve themselves from participation because of a conflict of interest? Having heard none, Madam Attorney, we'll continue to go forward. One of the first things we need to do is to get a motion to approve the minutes that was actually worked on. So Vice Chair, I know you've contributed to those. Any updates you want to provide on the minutes before we actually take a motion to approve it?
No, sir, Mr. Chairman. I think to reflect the changes we made.
All right, haven't seen any other comments? If not, we'll move forward. Haven't seen none. I'll tell you, I need a motion and I need a second to approve it. Got to get a motion to approve the minutes, please? Get a second.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. Any discussion regarding the minutes? Okay. Having heard none, I'll need to take a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Fantastic. I will let the pair a few comments on my own, or share a few comments on my own before we ask for our presenter to come forward with our first action item. I know there's been a lot of concern as it would relate to the work of this committee moving forward with the concerns that we have on regulating PFAS. I want to ensure everyone sitting here and those on the line that we take our responsibility extremely personal. And it's extremely important because we feel we live here in this state and the citizens do too. So we want to make sure that we do things in a very responsible way, in a way in which it's very transparent and actually reflects to the citizens of this state the responsibility that's been bestowed upon us to ensure that we accept this responsibility and carry it out in a very responsible way. And we accept that. I know there was some concerns as it would relate for us not making this an action item back in May. But one of the reasons we did that is because we didn't have the REI in our hands to have an opportunity 2 weeks in advance to review that. In fact, it was only provided to us after that May meeting. And for the members of this committee, I know we're going to talk about the REI today, and I look forward to the conversation around that. But having the document so that you can make a good informed decision, I think is a cornerstone of us carrying out our responsibility to do so. So having said that, I'd like to move into our first action item. So Michael, if you'll help us here, I know we have an action item to request approval to proceed to the EMC with a request for public notice and hearing for the proposed rule amendment to 15A NCAC 02L period 0202 water quality standards and physical and regulatory impact analysis. And I understand you do have a presenter for us today. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bridget Shelton with Division of Water Resources is going to kick us off today, and also Jessica Monty will also be presenting.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Jessica. So we look forward to hearing from you today and share with us what you have.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. As stated, I'm Bridget Shelton. I'm Groundwater Standards Coordinator with the Division of Water Resources. So I'm here today to present on the 15A NCAC 02L 0202 Groundwater Quality Standards PFAS rulemaking. We received a few questions during the last committee meeting presentation on this topic in May. So we just have provided some follow-up responses to those questions in these first few slides. So I'll read through some of these responses now. So we were asked what other states are doing to regulate PFAS in groundwater. So the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council has a number of technical resources for PFAS information. They maintain a PFAS water and soil values table, which can be accessed by this link right here. So this table was last updated in April 2024. It summarizes the available PFAS water regulatory values established by different states. Several states have guidance values, action levels, cleanup levels, standards, and promulgated rules in place to regulate various PFAS in groundwater, including these states listed here. As an example, Michigan has established cleanup criteria in groundwater for these 7 PFAS listed. As another example, Minnesota has established health risk limits for groundwater for these 6 PFAS compounds. Of note, North Carolina is the only state in the surrounding area, the Southeast Atlantic US, with a major PFAS manufacturer. So what are the traditional testing methods for the PQL for legacy PFAS? The testing method for groundwater is method 1633. It was finalized by the EPA in January 2024. It includes testing method for 43 PFAS, including the legacy PFAS, PFOA, and PFOS. And that final method can be accessed at this link right here. We were asked, where are the manufacturers of PFAS? North Carolina has 1 major PFAS manufacturer. PFAS can also be released from manufacturing operations that formulate raw material containing PFAS chemicals. Here are some examples of other industry categories that are potential PFAS sources. It includes organic chemicals. I won't read all of this, but electroplating, electric and electronic components, plastic molding and forming, textile mills, paint formulating, and airports. We were asked, what are the alternatives to PFAS in manufacturing if PFAS are no longer able to be used? This proposed amendment would not prohibit the use of PFAS in manufacturing. As we discussed in May, the existing rule states that substances without a groundwater standard are not permitted in concentrations at or above the PQL or the practical quantitation limit. The existing rule already requires a manufacturer, formulator, or other permitted activity to prevent releases of PFAS into groundwater that cause exceedances of the groundwater standards. That's either the PQL under the existing rule or the proposed standards if adopted. So the proposed rule amendment does not contain any requirements for the use of PFAS in the actual manufacturing processes. And finally, we were asked, what is the department's compliance and enforcement strategy and the burden on the state to implement PFAS groundwater and surface water quality standards? So groundwater standards are used as cleanup standards and to protect groundwater as a resource. This rulemaking does not change the requirements and procedures for addressing groundwater contamination. Only the cleanup standard is proposed to be changed from the current value. For providing clarity to these compliance assistant processes, please see Appendix B of the attached fiscal and regulatory impact analysis. Also, the strategy and the burden on the state would be the same under the existing groundwater standards or the proposed groundwater standards. The RIA outlines which DEQ programs implement groundwater quality standards and the impacts, which includes the potential for staff time saved in the future, which could be redirected to other projects or sites. So I will pause right here, see if there's any follow-up questions at this moment.
That'll be good. Let's see. I know I had one of the questions, the very first one, where we talked about what our neighboring states are doing, and I know you talked about those up in the Midwest a little bit. Right around North Carolina here, what are we seeing with our neighboring states, those that border us? What do you specifically see in there?
Right. Sorry, I'd have to pull up this sheet. It is very extensive and every state is different. Every groundwater program is different. As we touched on in May, and I'll touch on the groundwater is a state-run program. So all the values and all what they call their regulatory values are all different. So it's really hard to summarize.
I understand, but as we've talked in our other meetings, these neighboring states and how they manage this water doesn't comply with state boundaries, right? It comes into our state and it leaves our states, and so other states can influence what the water quality standard is here, whether it would be in a creek or stream or river, or even in some of our aquifers as well. And so wondering what they were doing in either implementing the testing, discussing what that testing might look like, what these PFAS compounds that they would look for in their testing program, just trying to get some understanding of, I know North Carolina leads in a lot of ways, and that's not a bad thing. But in doing so, what are our neighboring states doing in this space is what I was hoping to better understand. So, okay. Any other questions and follow up to the questions we asked last time that she gave a summary? So let's ask those now. I know she's got a presentation to go through as well. Any follow up? Yes, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just add, we do know South Carolina has initiated surface water sampling. They've been sharing some of their data. In North Carolina, obviously, as Bridget already touched on, with a major PFAS manufacturer in the state, we do see detections of groundwater in multiple locations, multiple counties in North Carolina. That does seem to differ, meaning for our state in the southeast, I would say Florida is another state that's doing a lot of active PFAS sampling. But speaking of neighboring states, we know that the surface water monitoring has started, but some of them have not seen the groundwater impacts either because they don't have the same type of facilities or they've just not had quite as extensive testing as of yet. So we'll start with that response as Bridget also references the other documents she has.
And we are aware of other states that have been challenged by this up in the New England area and out in the Midwest as well. So, okay. All right, Jessica, I think no other questions. Just continue on with your presentation.
Okay, so an outline for the presentation today. So I'll provide a background on groundwater quality standards, including how they're developed. We'll then move on to the topic of the proposed rulemaking, which is per and polyfluorinated substances, or PFAS. I'll go over the proposed groundwater standards for a subset of these PFAS compounds. And then Jessica Monti from the Division of Waste Management will give a summary of the regulatory impact analysis. And then we will present the proposed rulemaking schedule, followed by an action item request.
Thank you.
So there are 3 types of water quality standards in North Carolina. We have the groundwater, surface water, and drinking water standards. While these water systems may all interact, we have separate water quality standards and programs for each of them. Starting on the right with the drinking water standards, these are levels that are for public water systems for the treatment of drinking water to remove contaminants. These standards are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, a federal law. Groundwater and surface water standards are designed and developed to protect the resource of those water systems in North Carolina. Surface water standards are regulated by the Federal Clean Water Act, and groundwater standards are a state program. Here's a diagram that highlights the interactions between water systems and the impacts that groundwater and surface water can have on drinking water treatment systems. Groundwater is a bit hard to represent on a diagram as it exists underground in aquifers, but surface water and groundwater do interact as surface water seeps into the ground and groundwater can discharge to the surface. Discharges of PFAS into groundwater and surface water directly impact drinking water intakes. The proposed regulations from DEQ, both the groundwater standards and the surface water standards, as shown to the left of this diagram here, are to ensure not only the protection of these resources for the state of North Carolina, but also to ensure that PFAS contamination can be addressed and to prevent further contamination to limit the burden on drinking water treatment systems and reduce ongoing operation and maintenance costs so that they can meet the federal drinking water standards issued by EPA. So just starting from the basics a bit. So groundwater is the water that fills the cracks and other openings in bedrock and sand and is stored in reservoirs underground known as aquifers. Water that is contaminated or flows through contaminated soil can end up in the groundwater and lead to water quality issues. Groundwater is a significant drinking water supply source in North Carolina. It supports about 50% of drinking water use in the state, both through public water supply sites and private drinking water wells. 80% of approximately 2,300 public water systems rely on groundwater as a drinking water source. Often these are smaller systems. They provide drinking water to rural communities with fewer residents. Again, as a reminder, these public water systems are regulated through the Safe Drinking Water Act. 25% of residents also rely on groundwater source private wells. It is the responsibility of the homeowner to test and monitor the quality of their private well water, as North Carolina does not have drinking water standards for private drinking water wells. So moving on to the groundwater quality standards rule, listed here, 15A NCAC 02L. Section 100 as general considerations, policies, and definitions. Section 200 0202 is where you will find our groundwater quality standards. We have standards, about 200 groundwater standards that are all listed in a table. We have standards ranging from pesticides to metals such as lead and arsenic. These standards are all developed and calculated using the procedures that are laid out in this 02L 0202 rule, which I will go over soon. So first, when we say standard, we mean a maximum allowable concentration, which may be tolerated without creating a threat to human health or which would otherwise render the groundwater unsuitable for its intended best usage. And the best usage is defined in the rule as an existing or potential source of drinking water supply for humans. So these groundwater standards protect the groundwaters of the state as a resource for human consumption. As I mentioned, it's an important resource in our state as groundwater supports about 50% of drinking water use in North Carolina. These standards are used and implemented in many different programs, including site cleanups, risk assessments, and health evaluations. As I mentioned earlier, groundwater standards are not a federal program, they're a state program. They're done at the state level using the North Carolina rule listed here. While they are a state program, they are used in federal programs such as RCRA and Superfund, so these programs in the state do rely on the groundwater standards. First, I wanted to briefly cover some important languages included in the O2L, O202 rule. So there are two places in O202 where the practical quantitation limit, or the PQL, is mentioned. The PQL is a laboratory analytical term. The definition is highlighted at the bottom here. So it's the lowest concentration of a material that can be reliably achieved by an analytical technique during routine laboratory analysis. This also can be referred to as the reporting limit. In the rule, with the references listed up here, O202B states that substances which are not naturally occurring and for which no standard is specified shall not be permitted in concentrations at or above the PQL. So if a substance has no groundwater standard, it is not allowed in the groundwater in concentrations at or above the PQL. Just want to note here that we do not have groundwater standards for any PFAS substance. So currently for PFAS substances, the PQL is considered the existing standard or the baseline.
So just a point there of clarity there. So the substance in which we don't have a standard for, which is these PFAS compounds, we're currently regulating them at the PQL level.
The PQL is considered the existing
And
standard.
that's what we're using today. Okay, very important point. So it's not without a regulatory framework on these compounds presently. We're using our PQL level for this right now.
Yes, my understanding is yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, O202C states that when a standard for a substance is less than the PQL, the detection of that substance at or above the PQL constitutes a violation of the standard. So this is when there is an established health-based groundwater standard value, but it ends up being lower than the analytical PQL value. That PQL value would then be used as the compliance level for that substance, as it is not possible to measure to those calculated lower levels if they are below detection limits. Later on, I will show an example of this situation. Just want to note here as well that PQL values can change regularly. Laboratory analysis capabilities are constantly developing, and PQL values can also vary across different labs based on their capabilities. Moving on to how we develop our groundwater standards or arrive at the value that you see listed in the rule. I know you all have seen these slides before, so I'm going to go through them quite quickly. Please feel free to stop me if you have a question. So the rule lays out the process to develop these standards. First, they are established as the least of the values or criteria listed here. So we have the non-cancer threshold concentration. This is a concentration that protects against potential non-cancer effects from exposure to a chemical, so liver or kidney disease, for example. Next, we have a concentration which corresponds to an incremental lifetime cancer risk of 1 × 10⁻⁶, or 1 in a million. So this is a concentration that protects against potential development of cancer at a 1 in a million risk level. Next, we have the taste and odor threshold limit values. Then we have the maximum contaminant levels, or the MCLs. These are the federal primary drinking water standards issued by EPA. And next, we have the national secondary drinking water standards. Again, these are federal levels. They are non-enforceable, and they protect against organoleptic effects such as taste, odor, and skin and tooth discoloration. So to start to develop a groundwater standard for a substance, we first start by finding each of these values if they are available. And then we select the lowest value to be the most protective of human health. So focusing on these top two criteria right now, the non-cancer threshold concentration and the concentration that protects against cancer. These two values are developed through calculations. So while 3 through 6 here, these are found in the literature or the EPA databases, the first two require calculations as shown here. So here are the calculations. They consist of toxicity benchmarks and exposure estimates. The exposure estimates in the bottom here, square here, these are defined in the rule, so I won't go through these. The risk level for the cancer calculation is also defined in the rule. As I said, it's 1 × 10⁻⁶. Focusing on the toxicity values included in these calculations. So we have the reference dose in the non-cancer calculation and the cancer slope factor in the cancer calculation. Wanted to highlight these toxicity values because these in red right here are the values that we are looking for in the available scientific publications and references. So the rule defines which references we can look at to find these toxicity values highlighted in red. In order of preference, the rule lists these references right here. So EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS program, EPA's Drinking Water Health Advisories, and then other EPA health risk assessment data. If EPA does not have toxicity information in any of its databases or publications, then we look at other relevant published health risk assessment data and scientifically valid peer-reviewed published toxicological data. Just want to note here that the EPA references that are listed here go through a very intensive systematic review, and they analyze data and publications and produce assessments that go through following an intensive scientific review. The IRIS program, for example, will review hundreds of available peer-reviewed toxicity literature to develop a draft assessment for the chemical. This assessment then goes through multiple additional years-long steps, including agency review, interagency consultation. They then go to public comment, external peer review, and then a final agency review before a final assessment is published. So we've covered the groundwater quality standards and how they're developed in accordance with the rule 15A NCAC 0202. So now moving on to the topic of this proposed rulemaking today. So PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, are a group of manufactured chemicals that are used to make fluoropolymer coatings and products. These chemicals have useful properties, including resistance to heat, oil, stains, and water, and can be found in products such as clothing, furniture, food packaging, and non-stick cooking surfaces. These compounds are chemicals of specific concern and have a significant presence in North Carolina. PFAS are widely produced and used, and they are long-lasting chemicals that move throughout the environment and persist in the environment and essentially do not break down. They can build up in people, animals, and the environment over time. So to ensure the protection of groundwater as a source of drinking water and to protect human health, it is necessary to identify sources of PFAS contamination in groundwater, prevent further contamination, and take steps to remediate any existing contamination. So for this rulemaking, we've evaluated the available scientific data to develop groundwater standards for a subset of PFAS compounds. So quickly, some background information on recent EPA actions on PFAS, specifically for drinking water. So in March 2023, EPA announced the draft or proposed national primary drinking water regulations for the 6 PFAS listed here. And then in April 2024, they finalized these drinking water regulations. So that established legally enforceable levels for drinking water called maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. I've included a table directly from the EPA website that lists those MCLs and the compounds right here. Pointing out here again that national primary drinking water regulations are for drinking water and public water systems regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. I included this information on MCLs because if you remember, MCLs are one of the criteria that we look at when we're developing a groundwater standard. We also relied on some of the same scientific basis for a number of the proposed PFAS groundwater standards that these national drinking water regulations used. Another background slide on previous presentations. So information items on this topic were given to both the full EMC and this committee over the last few years, highlighting specifically the November 2023 EMC meeting. Dr. Franny Nelson with DEQ gave a presentation on the toxicological information for the proposed PFAS groundwater standards. It was very detailed. I just want to mention that here because I will not be providing as many details on that toxicological background, but that information is available online if interested. Information items were also given to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee in 2024 on affected sources and anticipated implementation requirements, the cost and benefits analysis approach, the plan implementation timeline, as well as an overview of the stakeholder meetings held by the Division of Waste Management and the feedback received from these meetings. And then at the last committee meeting in May, an information item was presented on the proposed PFAS groundwater standards and an overview of the regulatory impact analysis. Okay, so moving on to the proposed PFAS compounds for groundwater standards development. So there are 8 PFAS for which we will be proposing groundwater standards with their acronyms and compound names listed here. The asterisks to the right are to indicate which compounds are regulated by EPA's National Primary Drinking Water Regulation. There are thousands of known PFAS chemicals, which does make it difficult to measure and detect these substances, as well as challenging to study and assess their potential health risks. There is currently a lack of toxicity data for the majority of these thousands of PFAS compounds, but we've selected these 8 compounds to propose groundwater standards for a number of reasons. So these PFAS were selected for rulemaking because all 8 of these compounds have an available literature base that shows they cause health effects, and they have available health effects data to support the derivation of the necessary toxicological values for standards development. The literature bases for all 8 of these compounds have also been evaluated by a federal agency. These evaluations by these federal agencies have gone through an intensive review process, including a public and external review. These assessments have all also been finalized and published within the last few years, which ensures that the most recent and scientifically sound data has been evaluated. All 8 PFAS have also been detected in North Carolina's environmental media, and there is a final EPA test method for measuring these 8 compounds in different environmental media, specifically groundwater in this case. So just want to note here that if you're interested in a full toxicological summary for these 8 PFAS, Appendix A of the attached IRA documents, these literature bases and highlights the principal studies and health effects data used in the calculations of the groundwater standards more in depth. The calculations of these standards are also included in that attachment if you're interested. So here is some more summarized information for the proposed groundwater standards for the 8 PFAS. There's a lot of information here. We tried to summarize it as best as we could in this table. So we've included the references used for the development of the standards for each PFAS compound, the critical health effects seen in the literature, and the toxicity benchmarks and values available for each compound. In the reference column to the left here, you can see that the references that we used have all been published in the last few years. Most are from EPA publications. 2 are from the CDC's ATSDR publications, so they are all from federal agencies. The plus sign footnote designates the references that are also additionally evaluated and used in the EPA's National Primary Drinking Water Regulation. Again, just want to highlight the intensive evaluation and review process that each of these EPA and ATSDR assessments has gone through. The National Primary Drinking Water Regulation for the 6 PFAS listed here went through additional stakeholder input and public meetings, including from a science advisory board. For the IRIS assessments listed at the bottom, these bottom 2, IRIS in particular is considered a top tier reference in accordance with O2L 0202. It is the preferred source of toxicity information, which is why PFBA and PFHXA listed at the bottom here were also selected for the proposed rulemaking. North Carolina's own Science Advisory Board also reviewed these non-IRIS assessments and found them to be adequate and comparable to these IRIS assessments. So for the toxicity benchmarks and values available for each compound in the right column here, the bolded values are the ones that we use for the basis of the proposed O2L standard. Some PFAS compounds you can see have multiple values available. In this case, the lowest value is selected in accordance with O2L 0202 in order to be the most protective of human health. So all of this information shown on that previous slide in the table was used to develop groundwater standards for these 8 PFAS compounds in accordance with the procedures and calculations from the rule O2L 0202 that I covered earlier. So focusing on the left-hand column of this table here, so here are the 8 proposed PFAS O2L groundwater standards. They are shown here in units of nanograms per liter for comparison purposes, but we usually report standards in the rule as micrograms per liter. So if you look at the rule attachment, rule amendment as the attachment, the values will look a little different, but that's just from a unit conversion. As a reminder, when there is no standard for a substance, the PQL is considered the existing standard. So we've shown that here in the middle column. So we have the proposed standards and the existing standards. Also, as a reminder of the PQL language to the right here, where a standard for a substance is less than the PQL, the detection of that substance at or above the PQL constitutes a violation of the standard. So looking at this table, you can see that for compounds 3 through 8, the proposed O2L health-based standard is higher than the PQL reported by EPA. For compounds 3 through 8, the compliance level as shown in the right-hand column would be the O2L health-based standard, which is higher, so you can see, than the current existing standard or baseline of the PQL.
So let's just make a point there. So on the 8 compounds, if you look at what you've got in front of us, it would represent relaxing the standard from what the PQL is for those compounds.
Yes, so the PQL is an analytical reporting limit, so they're usually quite low, and so the calculated health-based standards are higher.
So that's a very important point. What's being represented to us is that we're not lowering the amount that would be allowable in the water. We're allowing more of it in the water because we're relaxing our standard from the PQL level to your regulatory level. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
these are, health-based standards.
I understand.
Yeah,
Just want
following the
everybody to
rules
be
and
clear here.
O2L. Mhm.
Okay, so, and some of them, we're lowering the level, thus what you've got in front of us, and some of them, we're allowing a greater concentration than what the PQL level is today.
Yes, yeah, just, I already pointed out, but that is the health-based level. These levels would not, based on our calculations, would not lead to any adverse health
Could I-
effects.
I just wanted to clarify something, Commissioner Reardon,
Yes,
if I
please.
may.
Commissioner
I
Gibson.
think none of the allowable levels are being lowered at all. They're either remaining where they are for 2, or they're going up, meaning more is allowed in the
That's
water.
correct.
Yeah, yeah. So I
that's
just want to
correct.
clarify. I think that's.
That's the point I'm
understanding.
making.
Yeah,
That's the point.
yeah, yeah.
This represents relaxing
Relaxing the standards.
we're relaxing the regulatory requirement on 6 of these compounds and lowering it on 2 of the compounds.
Or keeping it the same on
Or
2.
keeping it.
Yeah,
the
keeping
same.
it the same.
But that's a very important point
Yeah.
here.
Mr. Chairman, one thing too.
Yes.
One thing we need
Vice
to
Chair.
start doing is being consistent with how we're reporting this. The rule is using micrograms per liter, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's common
And we're
practice.
using nanograms per liter here, which makes these values seem really big but in essence, it looks like a sleight of hands from the average person looking at the data. It looks like a sleight of hand. I mean, I had to go on Google and do a conversion from micrograms to nanogram just to kind of
This
figure out where it is. So the rule needs to, whatever we put in these presentations and IRA, and we'll get to that later, but I just want to make that point where you're.
Yeah, and we can certainly,
This is
it's
part
normal
for trillion.
practice to report them in micrograms per liter in the O2L rule. In the table, most of them are reported in micrograms per liter, but there are exceptions. We can report them in micrograms per liter if preferred.
But every other document has been presented in this committee, the presentations, the IRA, all use nanogram per liter. That's the point I made.
Any other comment? Let's keep going, Jessica. Great job.
For the top 2 compounds, PFOS and PFOA, as we stated, the PQL language to the right does apply. So as you can see, the proposed O2L health-based standard for these 2 compounds is lower than the EPA reported PQL of 4. So in this case, the compliance level for PFOA and PFOS would be the PQL due to that O2L language to the right. Just want to point out, this is not a unique circumstance. We have a number of O2L groundwater standards where the calculated health-based value is less than the PQL. So I will now pass this off to Jessica Monty for a summary of the RIA.
Well, thank you, Bridget. I called you Jessica
That's okay.
already. Thank you. So Jessica, we
Present
knew you
us
were
so
coming. So thank you, Bridget.
Good afternoon, Jessica Monti, Environmental Program Consultant with the Division of Waste Management. I'm just going to give a quick summary of the regulatory impact analysis. We did present information on this topic at the last meeting, so didn't dive in too deep with this presentation on that topic.
Thank you.
The attached fiscal and regulatory impact analysis was approved and certified by OSBM per the Administrative Procedures Act. It includes the reason for the rule amendment, the fiscal analysis approach, cost and benefit summary, and couple of rule alternatives. Some of the supporting information that was included as appendices in the RIA was the toxicological summary with the derivation of groundwater standards and the calculation sheets. The Appendix B was the proposed plan for addressing PFAS impacts to groundwater at DWM regulated sites. That plan, just to clarify, is the plan for addressing PFAS impacts under the existing regulations, which would also be used under the proposed amendment. The plan will be the same either way. The only difference will be the cleanup level that we're using as the standard, either the PQL under the existing rule or the proposed amendment. And then the third appendix, we got assistance from a third-party consultant to help us work on the PFAS treatment costs for groundwater. And so they provided us with a technical memorandum of how the assumptions they made and how they calculated those costs. So this is just an impact summary of the rule amendment that wasn't in the last presentation. So we're comparing the rule amendment to the baseline. So in this case, as Bridget has mentioned, the baseline is the existing rule language saying that the PQL is used as the standard in the absence of a standard. So we're comparing the future with the rule amendment versus what will be done in the future under the existing rule if this rule amendment is not adopted. So one of the biggest benefits we saw was regulatory certainty for our regulated community, knowing, as Bridget mentioned, that the PQL can change, whereas if we establish a standard, that they can rely on that as being the standard unless there's a future rulemaking to change it. We also, because the PQL is not based on human health impacts, but the standards are, we don't expect additional impacts to human health risks with the fact that we are proposing standards that are higher than the PQL. Because the 6 of the standards are higher than the PQL, and 2 of them would be enforced at the same level that they are under existing rules, we don't expect to see any additional cost to the regulated community as compared to that baseline. But there is the potential for a benefit of future avoided costs, which could be a potential substantial economic impact to the existing sites that in the regulated community, which can include sites that are owned by local governments or private industry. That also might be savings to the Inactive Hazardous Sites Fund, so that the funds could be redirected to other site priorities, and also to state government staff time that might have to not necessarily have to have oversight of sites that would have had to go into assessment under the existing rule that might not under the proposed amendment. We provided the table summarizing the impacts. This is also in the regulatory impact analysis showing no additional expenses to the regulated community and no changes to the health impacts, but some of the costs calculated for at least one potential hypothetical DWM site from the proposed amendment showing potential avoided costs for capital expenses to install a treatment system, and then ongoing operation and maintenance and groundwater well operation, maintenance, sampling, things like that, that could be avoided due to having the higher standard. So the total range of potential costs over 10 years that could be saved because of this amendment at one hypothetical site would be between $600,000 and $3.3 million. There's a lot of variables that can go into estimating the cost that would be site specific, so we can't pinpoint exact costs for every site without assessing every site, but just tried to provide a summary for one hypothetical site.
Jessica, let me ask you a question while you're right there, and correct me where I'm wrong. But since we used a PQL level, because there was no standard for it, so the department used a PQL level, and because now you're going to propose standards that are above the PQL level or at the PQL level, there's no obligation to determine the cost associated with this because it doesn't change from what the cost would be at the PQL level. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the overall impact is 0. No matter what the cost is for any site to do this, it's the same.
So what's missing, wait, just 1 second. What then would be missing, because there was no obligation to establish the cost because you were using the PQL level, then we really don't fully understand and appreciate what the cost would be had there not been a PQL level here. So what we're doing is measuring from the PQL level cost up to the new standard cost, and because we're either increasing the standard in 6 of the 8 or keeping it the same in the others, we're not showing exactly what the cost is here.
We're trying to estimate as best we can what it would be under both circumstances. But yes, there's no obligation to show the entire cost because the net cost of the rule change is 0.
I understand. Just want to make sure everybody understands that. But Commissioner Gibbs.
Yes, thank you, and sorry to interrupt. So I think the interpretation, right, this example is for one facility where there might be a need to take action to decrease PFAS in groundwater. You're saying this facility would actually save money under these proposed new standards compared to the baseline. So an average site with a PFAS problem, the site owners who would be responsible for cleanup could save anywhere from $600,000 to about $3.3 million.
That's correct.
So this is going to cost less money for affected industries.
Potentially, if
Right.
someone falls under the circumstances that would allow them
Right,
to.
right.
stop
It'll
it, yeah.
cost less because they won't have to clean up when otherwise they would have had to clean up.
Yes, or could stop the treatment sooner than they would have otherwise because it can come underneath the standard faster.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And that, I'll turn it back over to Bridget for the last couple slides here.
Great. So here's our proposed rulemaking schedule. So stakeholder meetings, as I said, were held in January and February of 2024. So this is, as everyone knows, a topic of interest. So the multiple stakeholder meetings were very valuable to receive feedback. As mentioned, info items have been presented to the EMC and this committee on this topic over the years listed here. We are currently asking for approval to proceed to the EMC. If approved, we would go in front of the EMC in September to request approval to go to public comment and hearings. If approved, the comment period would be from October to December, and the earliest date for a public hearing would be October 30th. Again, this is a topic of specific concern in North Carolina and has great interest from the public, private citizens, and stakeholders. We consider the public input process an important step in the rulemaking process, and it will be particularly significant for this topic due to the existing interest. So we anticipate coming back to the EMC in March 2025, which would put us on track for a proposed effective date of May 1st, 2025. So this leads to our action item request. So we are requesting approval to proceed to the EMC with requests for public notice and hearings for the proposed rule amendment to 15A NCAC 02L 0202, groundwater quality standards, and the associated fiscal and regulatory impact analysis. I'll just follow up with our contact information here.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate that very much, Bridget. I know there's going to be some questions around the table, but there was one thing in the RIA. Who is best to speak to that? Is it Jessica? Jessica. Jessica, that was a very important point on page 13. I'd like to just make sure that in the RIA that we have, I'm assuming it's online and everyone else can see it now, but just wanted to speak to that. And others may have questions around the RIA. Yeah. Page 13.
Dylan's pulling it up for us now.
Okay, page 13.
And yes, the version that's posted on the website is the same. That's the final certified version, so you all have the correct version. Okay.
Okay, let's go down to number 1, where you have number 7, then A, then 1. But there's a point there I want to make sure everybody understands. And it says at the bottom of next to the last sentence, as discussed in section 8 of this document, the adoption of these standards will not change the level of public health protection already in effect. Is that true?
That's saying that at this moment, there was no calculation for the PQL to determine the health risks at the PQL level. But the proposed standards are based on human health risks. So we're saying that we're not going to, it's not going to change the risk because now we have something that was actually calculated based on health risks that we're comparing to.
So based on, we have PQL levels in effect today, and we're proposing regulatory levels. And what we're saying is, even if we adopt those regulatory levels, there's not a change in the amount of public health protection that's provided, because the standards are either equal to or lower than the PQ, or above the PQL, right?
Right. They
Okay.
weren't based on health risks before, and now they will be.
I understand.
Yeah.
But just so we're all clear here, that there are currently regulatory provisions in place in the context of PQL that allows you as an agency to regulate these compounds today with your
Yes.
PQL levels. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, just we'll make sure we're clear. I'll stop with that as chair. I know others may have questions, but let's be distinct with our questions and timely. I know it's getting a little bit late here, but this is critically important. Vice Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica and Bridget, for the presentation. Sticking with the IRA, I want to skip around a little bit, Jessica, so bear with me. Page 5, bullet number 4. Just some clarifications, if you would. It says North Carolina groundwater standards are not federal requirements, so there is no state level program that would need federal approval of these proposed standards to retain program approval. There's too many approvals there. What does that sentence mean?
It's saying that while surface water standards might need federal approval for us to retain our state level program, the same is not true for groundwater standards.
Okay, can you clarify that a little bit better in the IRA? Going on to the next sentence, where there is no federal equivalent for groundwater standards, they are critical components of state compliance with federally regulated programs. what does it mean that there's no federal equivalent for groundwater standards, but are critical for state level compliance? If there's no federal requirement, how is there a nexus for federal programs?
So that's getting to the fact that there is no federally based groundwater standards that are directly equivalent to the standards that we're trying to develop here. But because groundwater is used as drinking water, because it's used as a public drinking water intake source, and because there are now drinking water standards for PFAS, they're related to each other. And preventing discharges of PFAS to groundwater can help down the line, help us as a state comply with the drinking water standards where groundwater is used as a source of drinking water. So
Okay,
it's an indirect connection.
if we could address that in our IRA a little bit clearer, so that makes a little more sense. Appreciate it. Okay, I want to feed off the point that Chair Reardon was making. In several areas of this document, DWM states that page 5, bullet 6, that we're replacing existing standards of the practical PQL. Page 6, bullet number 1, the proposed, all those standards are calculated or proposed PFOA, PFOS are lower than the existing standards for PQL. So, and there is an existing standards, and you acknowledge that you guys already have a regulatory standard for it. Page 9, first full paragraph. Go down to the third sentence. The existing regulatory framework provides DEQ with authority to take action to address PFAS contamination for all PFAS. Page 13, again, it talks about first full paragraph on page 13. Existing standards already exist. So if replacing existing standards, what is DEQ doing now to regulate PFAS?
Michael, do you want to address that?
I'll be glad to. Michael Scott, Division of Waste Management. So we are at sites using the PQL when there are detections. We have a lot of sites that are currently in assessment mode, as our previous presentations before this committee have discussed. There have been notices of regulatory requirement, notices of violation that have had to go out related to PFAS detections in groundwater. So the PQL has been utilized. The issue we're really trying to reinforce before this committee is people are uncertain what the number is. And as Bridget and Jessica have noted, the PQL changes. You could use a lab in Ohio that may have one PQL, or a lab somewhere else that has a different PQL, and the PQL could change over time. I still get asked about 70 part per trillion. I can't convert it immediately to micrograms per liter, but you get my point, 70 nanograms per liter. So, you know, the question and an issue we're also seeing is people are saying, okay, this is a predominant issue across the country. We need to know the target. We need business certainty, and we need clarity on what we're striving for to protect groundwater in North Carolina. So yes, we are using the PQL. Yes, we've sent out letters, regulatory letters related to that.
Okay, I want to establish that because there was a May 1st, 2024 letter that Secretary Beiser sent to Chair Solomon and directed at the chair and co-chair of this committee. There's two parts of that. This is one quote. This is why DEQ is proposing state groundwater and surface water standards to reduce PFAS contamination of our drinking water sources. Another quote, setting groundwater standards protects public water supply wells and is the most equitable way to ensure millions of residents who rely on private wells for get the same protection as public water customers. Absent further immediate action by this commission, this letter is referring to this committee, residents and local utilities continue to shoulder the burden of treatment while groundwater cleanup is delayed. You just said groundwater cleanup is not being delayed because you have a standard and your document says that you are regulating at a PQL. So why did the secretary make that statement? I know you're trying to speak for her, but it's a relevant point based on reading the IRA.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, what's noted there, once again, back to the regulatory certainty, you know, taking a proposed rule that's based on concrete scientific information, out to public comment if that's the commission's decision. Obviously, we're at the committee stage now. That's important to disseminate that information for people to understand the target that they need to meet. We still talk to folks in the permitting sector, the business sector, even the local sector as far as residents who are not familiar with PFAS, and we understand that. It's not something that everybody needs to work on every day. We're putting a lot of work on it as DEQ so that others don't have to work on it every day. But the point being, some people still have unfamiliarity with this very important subject. So the standards development process disseminates that information, provides regulatory certainty, and provides values that are calculated based on accurate scientific information. When you ask people, are they meeting PQL? I will guarantee you half of the people won't know what the acronym is, and that's understandable also.
I'm making the point, there was a lot of media attention after the last committee meeting, before the last committee meeting. And there was accusations that this committee is not moving forward on regulating PFAS. I just want to make the point, the regulations are already there for groundwater. So I'm just trying to make that point that, so we can move on.
Let me pick up, Vice Chair, and give you time to think a second. Wanted to just clarity, for PFOS and PFOA, what we're proposing in that, you're proposing in the 8 that you're speaking to, they're lower than the PQL now, those two, right?
Yes.
And I think if I go back through the RIA, you've really established in here those two compounds, which I think EPA has says that are likely carcinogens, right? So they're the long chain, those are most important. They are the main drivers for site remediation right now, right? Two of those, the PFOA and PFOS. And the other 6, again, that you're proposing are above the PQL level that you're currently using today. Just so we're all clear, right? And just want to make sure PFAS, as it is now at this time, is really still not designated as a hazardous waste or hazardous waste constituent. Is that true?
Yes.
Even with all the science information that we have and everything that's supporting this, EPA is still being classified as not as a hazardous waste or hazardous waste constituent.
That hasn't been finalized. There was a rule put out for public comment, but it hasn't been finalized yet, so that's correct.
It's in the RFA. I just want to make sure that language is correct. Any other questions that we have from the committee members?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
since we're on PQL,
Commissioner
right?
King.
Page 12
Mhm.
on, let me make sure. It's page 10. I've got 2 questions. One's on page 10. One's on page 12, if I could, page 10.
Page 10? Yes.
I've got in my notes here from study and review. It's I think it's also important for the regulated community to have some greater certainty regarding what levels of these compounds would be required for cleanup. And by the way, thank you for all you do, Michael, for the brownfields and cleaning up. It's a great program. But required for cleanup that is more reliable and are consistent than the current requirement of having the practical quantification limit, PQL, as the standard. And since PQLs may change over time, I think we all agree with that, with changes in technology and the lab equipment that's going to be used, I guess my question are you proposing to set standards but regulate it at a PQL?
No, for the six of the 8, we're proposing the standards, and they'll be higher than the PQL, and they'll be regulated at the higher standard. But for just the 2, PFOA and PFOS, because the proposed standard is lower than the PQL, and the rule says in that case you enforce it at the PQL, for those 2, we'll still be enforcing the PQL, but only those 2.
So it's not conflicting with your proposal. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay.
Um,
Go ahead.
Yeah, and another one, I want to approach it from on page 12, first paragraph, in relation to IMAX. And Chairman Solomon had a really good time with IMAX years ago. Well, my question there on the IMAC is established for P4, Mr. Chairman, and per rule on the 15A and CAC 2L the 202 rule that was effective December 6, 2006. The IMAC was eliminated on November the 4th, 2022, per procedures outlined in 15A NCAC 02L 202C, based on a request made by a third party to the director of DWR. Because IMACs are established on a temporary basis by the director of DWR and not through the permanent rulemaking process, they are not considered the regulatory baseline. That's the way I understand it. But my question, I guess, why was the IMAC eliminated?
I believe we revised the 0202 rule too. Okay.
Yes. I thought it was eliminated in that particular case.
Yes.
Why was that?
At a request, and I will let Bridget answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the last review of the groundwater standards rule, we realized the rule was silent on the ability to remove IMACs. So that was that language was added in. We received a request to remove an IMAC. We evaluated the request. We decided that that was the, appropriate route to take, so it was removed.
Okay. Well, being removed then, P4 was a significant, that it justified an IMAC in 06 and eliminated in 22. Why hasn't the department taken steps to regulate it since then?
Yeah, so, 2006 was some time ago. The science has been updated since then. We agreed it was appropriate to remove that IMAC, knowing that this work from EPA was coming out soon. So this is the action we are taking now, proposing a standard in O2L based on that EPA science that came out within the last few years.
Okay. That's all right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Baumgartner.
So the basis of, sorry, I lost my train of thought. The IMAC is to establish a standard when it's requested or needed for a certain level. Why hasn't the department pursued an IMAC for any of the other compounds? I know PFOA, as Commissioner Keene stated, there's IMAC developed before PFOA before, but why hasn't one, if these are really needed now, why haven't you gone to an IMAC before? Plus, a lot of the basis for the IRA is regulatory relief. There's a lot of comments on regulatory relief. I would imagine if there was so much need for regulatory relief, somebody would have asked for an IMAC by now. Is that correct?
Go ahead, Michael.
So thank you for the question. I'll go back to some of this previous committee work regarding the IMACs and the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. There was active discussion amongst the committee. I won't on any means speak for the committee, but just what I remember being shared with me, IMACs have a place when they're requested of the department. There's a site going through a specific assessment and cleanup, and a target value is needed, and there's enough scientific literature to calculate that target value. This PFAS subject in groundwater is much broader, right? Multiple counties in North Carolina's 100. We're not talking about one site in Columbus County, one site in Buncombe County that's trying to do a cleanup. We're talking about a statewide groundwater approach. The other piece here with EPA's development of the MCLs, as Bridget walked us through, the scientific literature is there to propose these quantitative values versus one site going through assessment and cleanup and essentially requesting regulatory relief from the department. And that was the example Commissioner Keene referenced. That was a site working on PFOA. They requested a target value. That target value then was noted to be way higher than the current literature showed and what was being worked on by EPA, and that company decided to withdraw it at that time. So I hope that helps, but that was some of the committee discussion by this committee. IMACs have their place, but it's kind of a targeted place for sites. But when it's a broader approach, then having public comment is important. And that was another piece of feedback from the committee, that through the rule development process, you go out to full public comment. And with IMACs, that process, as you know, is a little different.
Missed it was for a specific site, but it seemed to me that you could develop an IMAC the way I was reading it. Maybe I'm wrong. That for a particular need that may exist. I'm assuming the PFOA IMAC was not just for that site. It was for other sites as well during that time, or just for that site?
It was
Okay.
requested by one site.
Yeah, but,
But it was applied across the board.
Let me
yes,
call on
yeah.
Chair Solomon.
Yeah, and I'll just ask and try to cut to the chase, because I'd like to see another paragraph in here too, because I worked with that IMAC so much with Bridget and others. At that time, and I don't remember exactly, but I think that IMAC was about 70 at that time. And, or two, was it two at that time?
2,000.
2,000 at that time. And to my memory, there was pressure, you can't keep an IMAC going forever, and it needs to be a statewide rule. And this is what I want to get in clarification here. And it's okay, it's just the facts, right? But I think back then, we were waiting on EPA or somebody to develop some kind of standards, which might have been the MCL. And quite frankly, I think the department just decided to do nothing until they got that. And I don't say do nothing, but status quo. I mean, you could have gotten somebody to write you for regulatory relief. You don't need to say that, but it was at 2,000. The rule changed to where you needed to either make it a permanent rule or get another IMAC. And you guys just decided it was okay till we wait till we get something from EPA. And that's my memory. But y'all just clean up whatever that was and add it to a paragraph. And that was my question. I think the level needs to be there, and a little bit of reasoning needs to be there just to show that y'all were regulating it and you chose not to regulate it for a while. Or you didn't get a request to regulate it. Back to the discussion of, I guess nobody felt they needed a lower value or a more relaxed value, or that asked for an IMAC. Is that true?
Director Scott.
Yeah, the IMAC that was requested, as I remember it, Bridget can help me here, but it was a specific site. They had PFAS, DTEX, PFOA
Yep.
in groundwater. They needed that for assessment remediation purposes. When that IMAC was then reviewed by the committee, the Groundwater Waste Management Committee, the current narrative was 70 part per trillion PFOA, PFOS combined. But even with the 70, we knew the scientific studies had advanced, and that number was going downward from 70. So I think it was a time frame where we knew the 70 wasn't right. The 2,000 was definitely not right. The entity decided to withdraw it. They did it in requesting to DWR. And so we were in that paradigm where we knew the values before us were not correct and they were going lower. And now we're here today where the scientific information's there. It's sound, been reviewed by multiple stakeholders, and these are quantifiable values that we really support, and want to disseminate if it's the commission's purpose.
And I agree. I just request, and I'm ex officio, so I can't vote, but I can participate. I just would request another paragraph in there to explain that, because when I read it, I went back and tried to remember what the levels was, and I'd have guessed 70, and you're right, it's 2,000. But if it would just explain that, then I think that would take that way, because several of these guys were like, didn't you do IMAX? And I said, yeah. I said, I don't remember, so.
That's where I was heading is, it's discussed that there was an IMAC, but that was it. There was no discussion why and why it doesn't apply or does apply to the situation. So that needs to be expanded on. If I could.
Yeah. Vice Chair, go ahead.
There's a lot of discussion in here in the RIA about regulatory relief. And what I'd like to see is some more discussion about who is asking for that regulatory relief and what kind of regulatory relief are you seeking? Who's asking for this to be done, and in what context? Are they brownfield folks that want to have, X number of standards related to, one of these compounds, or what? Expansion on that. And provide some discussion on that about the varying positions of the regulatory community. Health is mentioned, and we mentioned it earlier many times in this document, related to establishing standards based on health. But from what we're understanding, this particular standard revision, as it says in the IRA, is not based on health. It's a little bit confusing to set up the RIA to start talking about health, but this has no impact on health. So I would suggest those references to a health-based standard need to be removed from this if that's not what this is about. And if it is, fine. What I'm understanding from the IRA is this is not based on health.
The proposed standards are based on health risk. And we're saying that because the proposed standards are based on health risk and the existing standards were not, we're saying it's not going to cause any additional risks to health. And that's all we're trying to say.
So, can follow up on this? Because I did a similar exercise and I do word counts, right?
Yes,
I think
Chair.
I counted 138 times health was used. It was all used in the preamble to justify and almost, I won't say scare people, but say this is, I did, count them. About 130 sometimes. When you get down to the cost benefit analysis, the actual technical cost benefit analysis, it's mentioned 5 times in benefits. But it's really disproportionate in the first part of the document and really missing. But the truth, and I would like clarification because either it's health-based or it's not. You guys say it's not health-based. Why do we say all that health stuff early? If in the benefit cost analysis, including benefits, we don't talk about any health benefits. That just seems to be, and y'all can clarify that. I'm not trying to argue it here. I'm just saying, do the word counts and I can give you my numbers and take a look at it. But to support what Commissioner Baumgartner said.
Last one, a lot of your cost data, it seems, is based on the regulatory relief, the compounds that are higher than PQL or higher than PQL. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of focus on PFOS, PFOA, which are, the standard would actually be lower.
But would be enforced, it's the same as it is now. So there's no change. So it's 0.
But how that applies in this case, there's no cost focus on PFOS, PFOA. Everything is on the other compounds, it looks like to me.
That's the only circumstance where there might be relief, regulatory relief. There wouldn't be regulatory relief for PFOA and PFOS.
What I'm saying, there's probably cost compliance for PFOS, PFOA is not being captured. And that needs to be brought out more evident in the IRA.
So we're saying that the cost that we've estimated would be the cost for any of the PFAS, including PFOA and PFAS. And it would be the same under the existing regulation versus the proposed amendment.
If a new methodology comes out tomorrow that is lower than the existing PQL, and you set a standard of, I think it was 0.01 for PFOS or PFOA, then the compliance level would be what the PQL would be, correct?
Yeah.
So there would be an impact because now someone has to comply at a lower level.
They're still complying at the PQL because of the language in the rule. Even
But-
if the standard is lower or higher, as long as it's still under the PQL, they're still having to comply at the PQL.
So I get back to why are we setting standards so low beyond the PQL if that's the case?
The table, that we walked through earlier, provides that exact calculation. And as Bridget, I believe, referenced, there's other instances where the calculated value, meaning health-based value, is less than the current practical quantitation limit. So we're trying to show, based on the scientific literature, here's the exact calculation, as you referenced, the 0.7, the 0.001, but the current 2L rules default us to the current PQL, which is listed in the table as 4. So we're trying to portray the complete picture. Here's the associated risk with these compounds, meaning small amounts have detrimental effects. The rule takes us to what can be quantified by a lab, meaning the 4 part per trillion. So we tried in that table to clearly show that, meaning here's the calculation, here's what the current 2L rules default us to.
It's still a cost of compliance somewhere. If the PQL continues to drop and the standard's set at 0.001, at some point, there's a cost to somebody to comply. And
There would be a benefit eventually if the PQL keeps going down to the point where it gets lower than the standard, then they comply at the standard and they're having a benefit of not having to keep going down with the PQL in the future. The same as the other standards are.
Let me just, yes, Mr. Yarborough.
In page 33 and 36, it talks, several treatment systems are mentioned, obviously, and we've got analysis. Are there known byproducts of some of these methods? And has the cost been associated with it? I don't see that, but it's,
Yes.
it is in there.
Yeah, there's waste products and that was considered in the cost. And I believe it's mentioned in the technical memo that's in Appendix C.
Does it have in the RIA, I must have missed it then, it's about to describe what the byproducts produce, the extraction methods, and add those costs to the RIA.
Yeah, the total cost that we're including in the IRA was developed based on what's in the technical memo. So you'll see the cost in the technical memo, we're including the waste products for the total cost that they end up calculating, which is the number that gets plugged into the RIA.
Does it have a place where those byproducts are actually, where are they taken? What do you do with them?
I don't know that that is written in the technical memo specifically, since it would be different depending on the site and what's nearby and what the product is. So it's kind of a factor of, it would be site specific and different at any given site. So it's hard to predict for any one site what it would be.
So it could be impacted on private land or agricultural land as well.
I think we're just talking about waste management facilities that we're predicting the cost for there.
Sorry.
Stephanie Boyer.
So in the technical memo, it's similar to, in a sense, what we looked at in 2B. The treatment technologies are granular activated carbon, ion exchange, so media type resin removal tech options. The consultants, in the terms of the cost and where that would go, they had costed out thermal treatment, which would be the higher end of the cost as opposed to going to landfilling.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes,
I'm sorry, this may be my last
Commissioner
question, Mr. Chairman. Page 7, please, on the RIA. Something of this relates to the surface water meeting we had earlier, but just never really dug into it. I'm not going to do that right now, but
Thank
I did want to, Mr. Chairman, ask on page 7, out of compliance water supplies, and looking at let's see, I'm going to skip a lot of that. Private drinking water wells, it is important to ensure that these sources in North Carolina are protected. Got that. So that drinking water sources are able to meet MCLs. Check the MCLs if I can, just a minute. It states that my understanding is 1,961 public water systems are affected by EPA's drinking water regulations. Is that number correct?
I will ask.
1,961 public water systems.
I believe we just verified that before we put it in here, but I'll.
Yes, sir. Those number of systems are public water systems that receive their water supply through groundwater-based wells.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Assistant Secretary. I looked up and didn't see you. Over 90% of these systems, 1,790 received source water from groundwater supplies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So as of April 10th, 2024, based on single sample results, approximately 15% of the groundwater source systems measured greater than an MCL or high. So I guess my question is, 15% or 30 groundwater source systems measured greater than MCL or high for PFAS? Is it 15% or 30 groundwater source systems?
So I'm going to summarize this. Rebecca Sadowski summarized this at the last EMC meeting. And this is also documented in the surface water RIA. There are 100,790 groundwater-based drinking water systems in the state. Of that, 248 systems were estimated to exceed MCLs.
How many?
248.
48, okay.
And that serves 177,000 people in North Carolina.
Yeah.
I will note that 350 systems have not been sampled yet that are still part of our sampling queue.
Yeah, I think that's probably a follow-up question is what's single sample results. I just didn't understand single sample results and what that would imply. And how do we go about that through contractual cost basis and so forth, getting that information?
So I will summarize this at a very high level.
Yeah.
So Rebecca Sadowski, when she summarized the drinking water systems program and how they're affected by these regulated MCLs, She basically said that in preparation for the EPA's MCLs, the department started sampling, some voluntarily, some in partnership. And those consisted of raw water and finished water sampling over a period of several months. And the details are in that presentation. But I will also note that all of these systems were also required to be sampling and reporting to EPA under the UCMR program. And so nationally, we have all of these systems data reported, and you can do comparisons at the state level and what those levels are compared to other parts of the country. So we've had two data sets.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So that was my question, is just what kind of compliance enforcement measures, have the department taken with the 30 systems? Are the systems that are lined up here that you're
Right, those will be,
identifying? So what are those compliance enforcement measures?
so if I may, the EMC presentation that Rebecca laid out, the compliance schedule for MCLs for these systems, these drinking water systems are in a graduated schedule. They will be required to monitor, report, and eventually reach compliance through if treatment is required. But all of that is documented in our presentation, what that schedule looks like under the primary drinking water regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Any additional questions that we got?
Just
Commissioner Yarborough?
trying to get something in my mind. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but considering that PFOA and PFOS are the driver compounds, according to the RIA, that's the one that you this legacy compounds, the long chains and all that. And it seems like Gen X is the one that always comes up. And we know about those over the years. We keep adding, we've talked about how many thousands of these materials of other compounds there are, but you're looking at 8 total. 2 that's a legacy, 1 is the Gen X that we know. Would it not make sense to try to focus on those 3 versus the 8? Because again, I go back to what I asked last meeting. If manufacturers have an opportunity or need, and one is more expensive or more aggravating, if you want to put it that way, to use, they're going to go to another one. And we could chase this rabbit for 100 years. Would it not make more sense to try to concentrate on the 3? I'm just throwing that as a question more than a response.
Anyone like to speak to that? Michael?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Commissioner Yarborough, what we presented to the committee are the 8 where the scientific literature supports that development of a quantifiable standard. As Bridget mentioned earlier in the presentation, Dr. Nielsen presented a few meetings back regarding the prevalence of these in North Carolina. So PFOA, PFOS get a lot of national attention. They're present in North Carolina along with Gen X. But those remaining compounds we're also detecting in environmental media. And so they can come from a different or a variety of sources. But we've tried to couple what's found in North Carolina's environmental media with what the scientific literature supports as far as derivation of a standard, development of a standard.
And all of them you're already able to regulate. It's just different, trying to get regulatory relief on 6 of them. Is that correct?
So yeah,
What I
as
understand.
Bridget and Jessica walked us through the PQL and what it provides under the current 2L rules, we have that regulatory basis for PQL. But as you see with some of these other compounds, there may not be the necessity to regulate them at PQL. PFBS goes from 3 nanogram per liter or part per trillion to a proposed 2,000. That's a big difference. So, once again, it's a summation of what's present in North Carolina's environmental media, meaning we're finding in multiple sites across the state, and where we can, provide the development of a standard for this committee's consideration.
Well, I don't know if this is appropriate, but I'd like to make a motion.
Okay, hold just 1 second. Let's make sure that, I know what times we got to go. Is there any additional questions here? Because before we take a motion, do you want to pull up your motion
Oh.
in case, if this is where we're going.
See if it's still up here.
Okay.
There.
All right, thank you.
It's quicker than I thought.
All right, no further questions. Commissioner Yarborough, would you, like you said, you'd like to make a motion? We'll accept that motion at this time.
I'd like to make a motion to revise the regulatory impact analysis to regulate PFOA, PFOS, and Gen X.
Okay. Okay, so if I understand you correctly with your motion, you'd like for the RFA to reflect moving forward with having that, moving forward with that, with the regulation of PFOA and PFOS and Gen X. Is that correct? That's your motion?
That's my motion.
Okay. All right, having heard the motion, is there a we'll get there. Is there a second on that motion?
I'll second that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, with Commissioner King second that motion. Any discussion on the motion that's on the table to regulate PFOA, PFOS, move forward, have the RFA reflect on that, and Gen X, those three compounds? Is the motion on the table? Discussion? Yes. Commissioner Gibbs.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that based on some very recent, I'm just looking at a draft manuscript, my students and I have been sampling wells in southeastern North Carolina, and there's a real stew of PFAS. It's not just PFOA, PFOS, and Gen X. Altogether, that accounts for about half of what we see in this suite of wells that we've just sampled, maybe a little less than half. But there's a soup of these other things. In particular, we're seeing some of the other compounds that are on this list, including PFBA is commonly detected. We've found that contributes about 13% to the total PFAS if we kind of add up all the mass. So we're really seeing a real soup. It's really not just those three things. And for that reason, I would really support moving forward with the proposed standards as they are. And I wouldn't see too much of an additional burden really, because again, if these additional standards aren't adopted, actually, there's going to be even more than the standards imposed on those who need to comply are going to be even stricter because they're going to have to comply at the PQL. So they're not going to benefit from this regulatory relief. So we're going to, if we only move ahead with the three, we're going to be denying the potential for regulatory relief. I'll add one more thing. I've talked to a lot of private well owners that are affected, and it can be very distressing for them. There's a lot of fear around, will they be able to ever resell their land, for example? And especially, if you don't have any certainty about what the standards are, that is even more frightening for them. If we go forward with this proposal, we're saying, well, instead of, for example, PFBA, it's going to be considered contaminated if there's 5 nanograms per liter. We're saying, well, we'd allow 7,000 nanograms per liter, and it's still compliant, and that therefore would relieve concerns about property values. So anyway, I would really propose adopting these standards, all of them, to increase certainty for the landowners who have private wells that are affected, for the companies that are affected, for the companies that are out there trying to make technologies to clean this stuff up. I would really support going forward with the whole package.
I'll make
Any other discussion?
just
here,
a
Walt?
comment on that, and that's a good point. If it is a soup, and we have the 2 legacy compounds, if we take those out, from my understanding of the filtration system and the treatment, it takes all of them out. If that's the case, then we're probably doing a better service by taking that out, than saying, okay, one sample has 7,000, but we'll discount this other. We may not find it. If I was wanting to drink water, I would think I would be in that one mode than the other, than trying to say, well, I want to choose my poison. I'd rather have rye whiskey than a beer, but that's beside the point, I guess.
Any other discussion before we
Just,
take a
just
vote?
point of order, moving forward to regulate these 3, as the motion says, do you want to see the PFAS the RA come back to committee? Is that the suggestion, or is it going to full EMC? That needs to be addressed, just as a point of order. I know the motion's on the floor, so I shouldn't overly talk here, but
As I
I'd like to
see,
see it go to the full,
go to the full committee.
because I think that we've talked about this a lot, and I think it's time to do something, and
Okay.
I don't know of any other way to make it happen.
well, question, you guys asked for a lot of clarifications today. When is that going to get?
I would like to see it come back to the committee in September, and if everything we've talked about here and the additions are there, as well as changing into the compounds we're addressing, that's my opinion.
I thought, for clarity, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I thought that was the motion.
All right. So
Just the
we,
3 compounds and coming back to the committee, not going to the EMC.
and if everything
ready.
is good,
Yeah,
then we
eventually
go
going
forward
to the EMC. Yeah, that's correct.
That was my second
All right.
on his motion.
We're basically changing the RA to look at those 3 materials.
To those 3 compounds, comes back to the committee. If everything's good, then we push it to the EMC with those 3 compounds based on your motion. Is that correct? If it passes, it ain't passed yet. So having heard all the discussion here, okay. All right, as I understand the motion is asked that we're directing DEQ to redirect the RIA to address the 3 compounds, which is PFOA, PFOS, and GenX, to be the 3 chemicals to be regulated. When the RIA is cleaned up, sent back to committee for review based on the questions we've had today, then it would then be voted on to go to the full EMC. That's the motion before us. We have a first, we have a second. Do we take a vote? All those in favor of the motion as I have outlined it and been communicated by Commissioner Yarborough, please vote aye. Aye. All those opposed, please vote no.
No, I'd rather see us, yeah,
Yeah, I understand.
And
Having
I
heard,
understand that.
yeah.
having heard that, the motion carries and it was passed. Thank you. All right, Commissioner Scott, we have no information items. I think there is an item to come up at the EMC tomorrow. Would you brief us on what that would be since it originated out of this committee?
Yes, Chair Reardon, just reminding the committee of upcoming items tomorrow, or one item before the full commission. It's an action item requesting approval to proceed to public notice with the 2024 periodic review of the O2S rules and criteria for the administration of the dry cleaning solvent cleanup fund. So this is one of our DWM Superfund programs, as you remember, the dry cleaning program, and their first set of rules, or one of our first set of rules in waste management going through the periodic rule review process before the full commission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And our future meeting will be in September, is that correct?
Yes, we are not noting at this time any other items. We'll keep you and Vice Chair Baumgartner updated, except for what you requested to come back today in September, so we don't have additional items besides what was discussed today currently projected.
Any additional comments on your part?
I would just like to thank all the staff who worked on the RIA and the standard developments process. It's been a huge team. DEQ and a lot of external support also, as was mentioned earlier. It's just a privilege to work with such a talented group and their dedication on this important subject. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. And as chair, I want to thank everyone who stayed and thank everybody's interest in this. Our interest is in doing the right thing for public health, this committee as a whole. And I think you can see they're very pragmatic in their approach and looking at this very closely to ensure that we do the right thing for the citizens of our state, the current generation, and those yet to come in the future, as we all take this responsibility extremely important. So thank y'all. Having said that, I will bring this committee meeting to a close. Thank you.